But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. And Jesus says you got off to a good start, but there are a few things that I have against you. Remember back in Ephesus, there was only one thing that he had against them. They had forgotten their first love. But in this, we have a few things that need dealing with. First, some of you are holding to the teaching of Balaam. Now, what is that? The teaching of Balaam? Well, this is kind of a placeholder, if you will, for a specific kind of straying from God's path. It's even used in 2 Peter 2:15, which says, "Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing." So what is the way of Balaam, we should ask in our modern context? Well, the name Balaam in general means corrupter of people. That's what his name means. But this is referring to a very specific Balaam. If you spent time going to Sunday school in church, you've probably heard this name. The son of Beor, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel. This is Balaam, the historical person who's found in Numbers chapter 22 to 31. He dies in number 31, kind of a short career, but nonetheless, he's there. He's an actual historical figure. He was a sorcerer for hire, who's hired by the ruler of a small city-state to put a curse on Israel. As a sorcerer for hire, there's no conviction in what he does. It's not personal for him. It's just business. He's in the business of giving curses or blessings based on whatever the person is that paid for him to come. He loved being paid, as Peter says, more than any other conviction he had. So here's the story. Let's go back. You can find this in Numbers 22 if you want to go read it yourself. It's good reading. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites started moving up out of the desert, and everybody was aware as they were moving in through the desert and up into where they would eventually leap off into the promised land, that this people that were moving through the territory, that numbered in the millions, by the way, were blessed by God. And as the Israelites began moving through this territory, there were a number of small city-states that they began conquering as they went. Now, of course, all these city-states could have avoided all of this simply by opening their borders and welcoming the Israelites and saying, why don't you come on through our territory on your way to Israel, on your way to the promised land? But they didn't. They tried to restrict their borders to the Israelites, and so as a result, they ended up as objects of God's wrath. That's not a place you want to be. And so they chose to fight, and Israel wiped them out one by one. Now, Balak was leader of one of Balak, not Balaam. Balak was the leader of one of these states, and he realizes the spiritual nature of this fight. And so he hires a sorcerer. If this is a spiritual fight, it might be good to have a sorcerer on our side. So he hires Balaam. Balaam, who's from a region in Mesopotamia, to come down and put a curse on the Israelites. So Balaam travels down to Moab, but along the way, God confronts him. Maybe you've heard, this is the part of the story that most of us have heard in our Sunday school classes. You may remember that a donkey that was carrying him refused to go any further on the trail. So Balaam gets off the donkey, and he beats the donkey, and he tries to pull the donkey, and the donkey is refusing to go any further on this trail. And finally, Balaam beats the donkey, and the donkey turns and speaks to him. Now, I don't know about you, but if a donkey starts speaking to me, I'm starting to rethink my worldview. But not so with Balaam. He's like unsurprised by the fact that a donkey starts talking to him. Donkey's like, why are you beating me? Have I mistreated you at all? In any of our time, have I not gone where you told me to go? And Balaam's like, no, you totally went everywhere I told you to go. He's like, well, maybe I have a good reason for stopping, Balaam. And at that moment, Balaam's eyes are opened, and he sees an angel of the Lord standing on the path with a sword drawn. And Balaam realizes that the donkey saved his life. And so he promises to this angel of the Lord that he will only say what God tells him to say. That's his promise at that moment. And so the angel says, okay, you can go, and allows him through. And you think, well, okay, that's that. Balaam learned his lesson, right? He serves God now because he's only going to do what God tells him to do. Not so much. Remember what Peter said? Balaam loved money more than anything else. And his worldview hadn't changed at all from that encounter. So he finally arrives in Moab, and he tries to put a curse on Israel, but he can't do it. Why? Because the only thing that can come out of his mouth is a blessing for the people of Israel, because that's what God intended. That's what God wanted. And now Balaam, because of his promise, can't do anything but what God wants for his people. And so he speaks a blessing on the people of God. Now Balak hears that, and he's like, excuse me, paid you to put a curse on them, not a blessing. What are you doing? And Balaam says, I can only say what God wants me to say. And Balak's like, try again. Okay. Balaam goes out, pronounces another blessing on the people. And Balak's like, what are you doing? Try again. Balaam goes out, pronounces another blessing on the people. And Balak is just beside himself, because this is not what he's not getting. He's getting the opposite of what he paid for. And he's ticked off. And Balaam says to Balak, look, as long as these people serve God, you can't defeat them. Stop trying. So here's what you need to do if you want to win this fight. You need to get them to stop serving him. If you can do that, then you have a chance. I'm thinking to myself, seriously, Balaam? After all that you've encountered on this whole trip, that's where you go? Anyway, he teaches Balak to have the women of Midian seduce the Israelite men. And when that happens, the Israelites start to compromise, don't they? They start taking the Midianites as wives, which was something that God had strictly forbidden in Deuteronomy. It says this in Deuteronomy chapter 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall not intermarry with them. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Now there's a specific command there, isn't it? You shall not intermarry. But these women look good, and they have loose morals. And behind all of that, you have the same exact issue that we see in the garden with Adam and Eve, right? Did God really say? Instead of it being a fruit, now it's these women. These women look good, and you can hear, there's no recording of this in the word, but you can almost hear Satan whispering to all of these young men, did God really say that you must not touch these women? Now this is where the beginning of all of the problems start for the Israelites. These women begin quietly pulling these men into idolatrous, immoral, paganistic lifestyles that they were a part of. And that union then with the world, that compromise that they made, corrupts them. And in chapter 25, we see the Israelites engaged in the worship of Baal, a false god. You know him as Baal. One sin leads to the next, which leads to the next for the Israelites. The intentional work of cursing the Israelites didn't work. It couldn't work because God was on their side. But if you could get them to compromise and reject God, the God of their youth, well, then you had a chance. And as they compromised with temptation, they became more and more like the culture around them. And what started out as blessings from God turned into curses, as God sends a plague among the people, and 24,000 of them die. So back to Revelation. Jesus is telling Pergamum, you're allowing people into your midst who are acting just like Balaam. They're allowing ideas and philosophies in amongst you that are seducing you back into the very culture that you have been pulled out of. You've been delivered from this culture, and they're saying, oh, these philosophies are still good, which are allowing then the church to go right back and participate in the idolatry and in the immorality of the culture that they live in. Remember, they live in Satan's kitchen. The temptation is all around them all the time. So remember 2 weeks ago when we looked at Ephesus, who had lost, the one thing was they had lost their first love. Do you remember though what they did initially? Right? We looked at it in Acts. As they came to saving faith in Jesus Christ, they brought out all of their books of sorcery. Oh, Balaam? They brought out all of their books of sorcery and they burned them at no small cost to themselves. That was the level of their commitment to Jesus. But not so here with Pergamum, apparently. Instead, they stay with their background. Remember back in the letter to the Ephesians, hey, they stood against the Nicolaitans. They hated the Nicolaitans. And God says, I also hate them. And look at what we see here in verse 15. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Who is this group that we've heard now twice? Now, we don't have much information to go on in terms of the Nicolaitans, but we do know that both Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, two of the early church fathers, wrote about the Nicolaitans, and they said this: they live lives of unrestrained indulgence, abandoning themselves to pleasure like goats. They're animals in their pursuit of pleasure, in other words, leading a life of self-indulgence. Now, it may be that they were some sort of Epicurean sect, just feeding themselves whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it, pretending to be Christians. That's very likely the case. And I say pretending to be Christians, not out of some sort of self-righteous judgment on my part, but because Jesus himself says, I hate the Nicolaitans, which means they cannot be children of God. And all of this feels very similar to what was happening at the time of Balaam. Somehow a teaching had insinuated into the church that said, did God really say? Do you really have to change everything? I mean, some of that stuff was fun. We should go back to that. And apparently some in the church were promoting this, even while others were laying their lives down for the gospel. That's what you see in this passage. And this indulgence and desire for pleasure then was drawing people back into the world from which they had already been rescued, back into the culture, back into idolatry, back into forms of life and thinking and behavior from which they had already been delivered. They were causing people to stumble. So this was corruption in the church of Pergamum brought about by compromise with the world.